17th of July, Schiphol Airport, Amsterdam.
Remaining passengers requested again C72 and immediate landing.
283 passengers and 15 crew board a Malaysia Airlines flight bound for Kuala Lumpur.
Salam Masur, ladies and gentlemen. This is a safety announcement.
Flight MH17 takes off at 12:15 p.m. Four hours later, over eastern Ukraine, a missile blows the plane from the sky. The shattered remnants fall into a sea of sunflowers. The tragedy turns attention to a bloody civil war that's largely passed the world by. Despite Russian denials, Western leaders immediately blame pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine, armed and backed by Russia.
Evidence indicates that the plane was shot down by a surface-to-air missile that was launched from an area that is controlled by Russian-backed separatists inside of Ukraine.
Russia's President Putin tries to shift the blame to Kiev.
Этой земле был мир, и во всяком случае не были бы возобновлены боевые действия на юго-востоке Украины. И, безусловно, государство, над территорией которой это произошло, несет ответственность за эту страшную трагедию.
His claims are at odds with a weight of evidence suggesting that Russian-backed separatists using a Buk missile system shot down MH17.
I can inform you that
The Abbott government outgunned the world with the strength of its rhetoric.
Minister Bishop.
This looks less like an accident than a crime. I want to repeat this. As things stand, this looks less like an accident than a crime. And if so, the perpetrators must be brought to justice.
I give the floor to Her Excellency Miss Julie Bishop.
Early on, Australia gained kudos for steering a resolution through the UN Security Council that was meant to safeguard the evidence and allow access to the crash site.
The message from this unanimous resolution to those at the site is: do not tamper with the evidence. Allow the investigators full access, unimpeded, unfettered to the site. Do not touch the belongings of the victims. They're not yours. They belong to the families and they are evidence. And allow the bodies to be retrieved. The message to the perpetrators from the United Nations Security Council resolution is: you will be found and you will be brought to justice.
Worthy sentiments ignored, high hopes unfulfilled. 38 people who called Australia home died in this disaster, but no nation suffered more than the Netherlands. 193 Dutch citizens were killed. MH17 is viewed as Holland's 9/11.
How horrible must have been the final moments of their lives when they knew the plane was going down. Did they lock hands with their loved ones? Did they hold their children close to their hearts? Did they look each other in the eyes one final time in a wordless goodbye? We will never know. The demise of almost 200 of my compatriots has left a hole in the heart of the Dutch nation. It has caused grief, anger, and despair.
The collective outpouring of grief and anger surprised even the Dutch. What do you mean by it was un-Dutch?
Well, there's been a debate on that, that we don't have a tradition of national days of mourning. It's almost taken as imposing mourning on people. Everybody does it in their own way, is the Dutch line.
It was emotional. And that's a sort of paradox, because we are a rational people, a calm people, a tactical people.
A week after the tragedy, outside the departure terminal at Schiphol Airport, the pavements are washed with flowers and tributes to the lost. Some of the flowers are starting to wilt and fade, but not the grief or the anger.
It's a nightmare. Really nightmare.
Rob and Selena Fredericks lost their 23-year-old son Bryce and his 20-year-old girlfriend Daisy in the tragedy. The young couple lived at home with Bryce's parents.
I can't tell you, it's horrible. Everywhere in the house they are. Everything I see, I have a memory with both of them.
It's like somebody took a piece of your heart. It's crazy.
The family has deep connections to Australia.
My husband has one brother and 3 sisters living there, in Cairns, Brisbane and in Sydney.
Bryce learnt to dive on the Great Barrier Reef off Cairns. When they perished, the young couple were on their way to Bali for a diving holiday. While many relatives prefer to grieve privately, Rob and Selena have consciously chosen to share their pain. So the world remembers.
I know, everyone knows, when something bad happens in the world, the whole world is in grief, and a week later something else happens and they forget about it. It's something new. But this is not finished.
And you don't want the world to stop watching or stop listening?
Yeah. And I hope people, when they see what's going on, how we are grieving, and what beautiful people they killed, they have to stop.
Selena and Rob have met every military plane that flew from Ukraine bearing coffins, hoping the remains of their loved ones might be on board. It's given them great comfort, though they fear the bodies are still at the crash site.
Close my eyes and I can still see the site over there, imagining that there are bodies, still bodies and body parts who might be from Daisy and Bryce. And no one can enter the site. No one can. It's horrible.
The army barracks at Hilversum, Holland has become a makeshift morgue, another focus of mourning. This is where the painstaking process of identifying victims is taking place.
How many people are working on the investigation, Howard?
Well, here at the temporary mortuary.
Howard Way from the British Disaster Victim Identification Team is one of the leaders.
There's over 200 personnel here from countries across the world. Obviously, the countries concerned in the disaster, so obviously Australia are well represented here, and Malaysia. We've got to deal with...
Many of the investigators worked together a decade ago after the Boxing Day tsunami in Southeast Asia.
How much more difficult has your task been made by the delays in getting the bodies out of the crash site?
Well, it's an unusual investigation because we haven't had access to the scene. The disaster victim identification investigation, which is my area, that begins at the scene, because sometimes the context of how human remains are found and property with them assists a speedy identification. We don't identify people on property, for example. but it gives us a good clue as to who they are. Yeah, so it's unique circumstances. We may never deal with something like that again.
How do you feel about what happened on the ground in East Ukraine?
Well, it's not ideal, and but it's a politically volatile area of the world. It's frustrating, obviously, but we will still identify these people here in the Netherlands. But obviously, the wider criminal investigation, so it'll certainly have an impact on that.
The reality is the investigation's been compromised by lack of access to the crash site, initially blocked by pro-Russian militia, then by a military offensive launched by the Ukrainian army.
Давай. You're going to major bit of fuselage on the right-hand side. Another bit of fuselage.
For a while, the Australian contingent on the ground was full of bravado, or denial.
That area. So if you step into the paddock, you'll be stepping into the areas that we're trying to work. So that's going to slow us down. So we ask you not to do that. Guys, you'll get plenty of footage off the road.
Can you hear the shelling?
Yeah, of course.
What do you think?
It's not landing here, so it's okay.
But you're still smiling?
What do you do? We've got a job to do, so we'll get on.
But the optimism wouldn't last. And the naive assumption that Kiev's pro-Western government would suspend hostilities while the bodies were recovered proved to be naive indeed. What do you make of the Ukrainian government's tactic of ramping up the hot war against the pro-Russian separatists after this terrible disaster?
From a military point of view, it made perfect sense. I guess that the thing is that since the end of the Cold War, we've become sort of used to this eternal peace idea.
Dr. Christ Klepp is a military historian from the University of Amsterdam. He's been analysing the tactics in the war.
I think that the Ukrainian army did not allow those investigators in because they felt there was a very basic military operational argument, which is we now have the opportunity, we have the time frame, the window of opportunity to drive them from what, from our point of view, from the Ukrainian point of view, is a very important line of advance. Because if they go through the crash site, which they did, they will split the separatist area in two, allowing them to be wiped out separately.
Russia and Ukraine share a 2,300-kilometre border. The MH17 crash site covers a stretch of land between the rebel strongholds of Donetsk and Lugansk, right in the heart of the war. Neither side was willing to give ground here in this strategic territory. Rather than cease fire after the crash so investigators could safely access the scene, Ukrainian generals drove home their military advantage.
Of course, it's pretty coincidental that this happens at a time where the international community has pointed at the separatists and said, you are the primitives, you are the bad guys, you are the scum of the earth. And I really think that the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian government is using that dynamic, that momentum.
It's 6 a.m. at Eindhoven Air Base in the south of the Netherlands. The Australian military is loading up a giant aircraft, a C-17, bound for Ukraine. Its cargo, vehicles, medical equipment and supplies for the multinational team on the ground in the war-torn east.
Checked SS reset pushback SS lights.
Hoping to complete the repatriation of human remains from the crash site. In late July and early August, Australian RAAF C-17s were flying round the clock from Eindhoven to Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city.
The aircraft can carry up to 60 tonnes of cargo, and all in all it weighs at max weight 260 tonnes. So it's a 50-metre wingspan, 50 metres long, it can fit a fair bit of stuff inside.
Squadron leader Dean Bolton is a veteran airman. He flew corpses back from Ukraine to the Netherlands as part of Operation Bring Them Home.
What kind of reaction did you get from relatives of the people who died in that crash?
We met them after the flight. The families came on board the aircraft and met the crew. They were thankful that we were there to help, and obviously very emotional for them and some of the crew members as well.
Those bodies hadn't been treated with a lot of respect before they got on these aircraft.
Look, at the back of the aircraft was where they came into the care of the RAF, and we did the best we could to show utmost respect for our victims and deliver them back to the Netherlands where they can hopefully make the journey back to their families.
Just after we land at Kharkiv Airport, the very last plane repatriating human remains takes off from Ukraine. It's Monday the 4th of August, and tons of heavy equipment is still being transported in for Operation Bring Them Home. All for nothing. 2 days later, the Dutch and Australian governments announced they're suspending the mission.
It's the middle of the night at Kharkiv in Ukraine, just after 1:30 in the morning, and the multinational force that said it was going to bring the bodies home is starting to pull out. First the Dutch police, the Australian Federal Police soon to follow. The increasing conflict on the ground making it just too dangerous to continue the search for bodies. No one knows when the search can resume, if the search can resume. War doesn't stop for such things.
At Slavyansk in eastern Ukraine, a festival's underway. The statue of Lenin overlooking the dancers is evidence of the region's ties to Russia and its recent Soviet past. A crowd of locals enjoys the show, but the music and dancing's at odds with tensions in the town. Slavyansk was one of the first cities to fall to the pro-Russian separatists. It was only recaptured in early July. There are snipers on the rooftops and soldiers everywhere.
Юлия Мартынова.
15 kilometres south at the town of Kramatorsk, the Ukrainian army is preparing for war. Not so long ago, this base was in enemy territory, surrounded by rebel fighters. Now it's a stronghold of the Ukrainian army. It's allowed a small group of journalists onto this base for the first time.
Справа здесь заправочный пункт, где подъезжает техника, заправляется и уезжает на задание. Вот эти большие машины, это машины предназначены для эвакуации, это тягачи.
Soldiers here have seen death and injury. This man has recently returned from a battle against the separatist militia.
Пулеметчика 8 пулевых ранений было. Раздроблена коленная чашечка. Вроде имплантант поставили в Харьковском госпитале. Сейчас тоже идет на поправку. Если даст Бог, может, завтра или послезавтра к нему и в гости сходим.
An armoured column heads out from the base at Kramatorsk towards the battlefront. It's passing through areas safely under its control, but even here, opinion is heavily divided. There's a lot of sympathy for the rebels and a lot of resentment about the damage the conflict has wrought on the ground. In the nearby village of Semenivka, the Ukrainian forces are well known. The villagers have been on the receiving end of their artillery fire. This used to be rebel-held territory and a key transport route for the pro-Russian separatists. Semenivka became collateral damage as the Ukrainian army retook the region, and blew the village to smithereens. Beyond the bullet holes on this gate is the home of Alexander Marinenko and his family. They returned 2 days before we met them to find extensive damage.
А здесь, видите, вот все погорело. Попала бомба туда или мина туда на эту сторону, все сгорело. Нам позвонили.
His mother and father-in-law, the children's grandparents, lived on the other side of the wall.
Все погорело. Телевизор сгорел, холодильник, мебель вся сгорела, вещи все сгорели, все сгорело. Бабушка, короче, приехала с дедом, все, нету ни зимние, в халате все уехали. Вот сейчас оно дальше еще упадет, и что делать, неизвестно. И кто будет помогать.
Destroyed.
Alexander takes me inside the devastated building. There's live electrical wiring hanging where the roof used to be. His mother-in-law, Ludmila Krivkova, is 74. She shows me what used to be the family cellar.
Ну, мы два это самое, и днем, и ночью тут были, несколько дней тут были у подвале. А если б ми тут остались, зараз подивіться, що там було б з нами.
So she's explaining to me that the bomb actually destroyed the basement. The place you would hide when bombs hit was actually destroyed when they shelled this place. So it was very lucky you weren't living here.
A strange twist of fate took Ludmila away from here when it was bombed. She was having major surgery.
Ми б, наверное, если б не операція, наверное, б до сих пор там були, тому що мені страшно. Мені сказали, що тут нічого немає. Сусідка сразу позвонила, та каже, тетя Люда, ми залишилися з вами без жилья. Думаю, ну що вона балакає? Ну як це без жилья? Я навіть поняття, я представлення не мала. Ну, а потім прийшла, ви знаєте, це перший раз я заплакала.
There's loss and grief on both sides of this conflict. Three months ago to this day, this congregation and its minister were terrorised by pro-Russian militia with terrible consequences. Father Alexander Pavenko leads the service.
Исповедуйте Богу свою признательность, свою, если хотите, нищету. Не так на улице поймал.
He urges love and forgiveness, which is remarkable under the circumstances.
Да, я потерял 2 братьев и 2 сыновей. Вот после такого же воскресного служения 8 июня пришли люди недобрые, ополченцы, так званые. Вот на пороге этого молитвенного дома. Это была троица с оружием в руках, с нецензурной бранью, с оскорблениями. Забрали 4 моих близких людей вместе с их транспортом. Лишили их жизни.
The bodies of Father Pavenko's kidnapped brothers and sons were found in a mass grave outside of Slavyansk. Father Pavenko says he has only one question for those who killed his cherished family. What was our crime?
И даже к тем людям, которые делали нам зло. У нас нет ненависти, нет зла. Это обманутые люди, обольщенные пропагандой. Мы живем среди этих людей. Многие люди ушли отсюда, те, которые делали зло. Некоторые остались, но это наши люди, среди которых поселил нас Бог.
How do you see this conflict ending?
Все хотят мира, но за это ничего не заплатить. Так не бывает. Все чего-то стоит, все имеет в себе цену.
At a military checkpoint outside of Slavyansk, armed soldiers check passports and search cars. The checkpoints are ubiquitous. During our time in Ukraine, the atmosphere at checkpoints became increasingly tense. Troops apparently fearing that separatist militia were heading from points east, hiding among many thousands of refugees fleeing the fighting. A convoy of vehicles bearing refugees takes a break during its journey from the war zone. We join the exodus as the bone-jarring buses roll along the ruined roads. The people on board are fleeing the town of Krasny Luch in the Lugansk region close to the Russian border, one of the main arteries for rebels transporting arms and reinforcements from Russia.
I'm scared. I don't want the country to be destroyed.
Maria was studying languages before she was forced to flee.
I study in Lugansk, and as they bomb the town now, and it's almost totally destroyed, I don't know when we will be able to continue studying at the university. It's a big problem, and I'm really worried about it.
How are the people in your town feeling when the bombs come down?
They all got very panicked, terrified. Everybody got the same reaction, and they at once wanted to leave the town.
The journey itself is not without risk. Less than a fortnight after these people made their way west, another convoy was reportedly fired upon and a dozen people incinerated. En route to the safe haven of Kharkiv, we're stopped at yet another checkpoint.
Вы меня снимаете? Все, удачи, до свидания.
Alina Nikiforova has left her home in Krasny Luch with her parents, her young daughter and a rather fat cat in tow. After about 5 hours on the road, the convoy of displaced people arrives on the outskirts of Kharkiv. The family enjoys an emotional reunion with Alina's oldest daughter, Yulia.
На вдвоем мы. А куда складывать?
2 days later, we join the family as they prepare a twilight barbecue.
Нет, вы тут пока поставьте, пожалуйста.
Here, the only battle is getting a meal ready before sundown. But it's a different story back home. While they cook at peace in a park, intense fighting's underway in Krasny Luch as the Ukrainian army moves to seize it from the rebels.
Потому что как только мы уехали, наш город полностью бомбят, стреляют. Мы просто счастливы, что нам Бог помог выскочить в последний момент. Опасно. Мы не знали, куда едем, но это был последний шанс вырваться нам с боевых действий. Спасти ребенка маленького, у меня small girl, и нужно было спасти ей жизнь. И мы не знали даже, насколько удачно мы сможем выехать.
Even this close-knit family is divided on the conflict. Yulia is a Ukrainian patriot. Her mother is pro-Russian. But politics play second fiddle to love and food. They're renowned cooks who've won a competition in Ukraine, and despite their hardship, they extend us a kind offer.
Мы очень ждем вас, когда закончится война в нашем городе. Покажем вам, как мы живем. Угостим вас варениками с вишней. Приезжайте на наши украинские блюда. Обязательно.
Спасибо. Спасибо.
Дякую.
If they still have a home to go to. A day later, a convoy of 200 Russian trucks begins making its way to the Ukrainian border. According to Russia, it's a humanitarian mission. No one seems to know whether it's really an aid convoy or a Trojan horse. Is it a provocation to Kiev, a prelude to invasion, or is Putin calling the West's bluff? What is President Putin's agenda?
President Putin's agenda is keeping everyone confused. I mean, that's a good policy, because then you're probably always right. People tend to look at Putin and say that he does not have a policy. No, his policy is not having a policy, because that way he keeps everyone confused.
I think Russia is trying to keep its sphere of influence from shrinking. And what is left in Eastern Europe is mainly Ukraine and Belarus. I think it wants to prevent those two countries from spinning out of its orbit. And Ukraine has already done so to a large degree. A lot of Russians feel that Ukraine is actually the heartland of Russia and they've lost it.
But Russia seems determined not to let Ukraine go. Even as Putin and Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko met in Minsk for peace talks, NATO was gathering evidence of Russia invading Ukraine's sovereign territory and fighting a hot war on the ground.
The satellite images released today provide additional evidence that Russian combat soldiers equipped with sophisticated heavy weaponry are operating inside Ukraine's sovereign territory.
President Putin and let's say the leaders that he represents, unfortunately, are only impressed by strength.
Retired four-star General Dick Berlijn is a former Commander-in-Chief of the Netherlands Armed Forces. He argues that Putin is trying to re-establish a Soviet-style sphere of influence.
He probably wishes to re-establish that influence sphere, let's say, towards the boundaries of the former Soviet Union. And I think we need to start sending very clear messages that this is something of the past. The world no longer functions like that.
How does the West combat that?
Up until now, very poorly. We haven't been sending coherent messages, not as NATO, not as the EU. It's very strange, of course, when we talk about sanctions, that we cannot agree in Europe on which things should be sanctioned. We see that large countries still have a very large interest in dealing with Russia.
It's telling that the sanctions imposed in the European Union exclude Russia's #1 export, the gas that flows through Ukraine to the West. The backdrop to the terrible conflict in Ukraine and the response to the MH17 disaster is oil and gas. The Russian economy depends on exports of oil and gas. Much of Europe, in turn, is heavily dependent on Russian gas. Even Ukraine, without Russian gas in the winter, its citizens would freeze. The politics of gas and oil has defined the way that nations have responded to this conflict. It's tempered the sanctions that Western nations are willing to impose, and behind the way various nations have responded is a whole lot of vested economic interest.
It's absolutely a factor. The fact that many countries in Western Europe, for instance, are dependent on Russian gas, of course, makes them very reluctant to speak very loudly against Russia. If that dependency was not there, of course, you're much freer to speak out. So this is absolutely a factor, and that should teach us a lesson. We should never, never, never be dependent on a party or a partner that is not playing by the same rules, that is not respecting human rights, etc., etc. If you do become dependent on such a party, you have very little room to move.
A third of Holland's crude oil imports come from Russia, and Russian companies have major interests in refineries in Holland. Russia is the European Union's third largest trading partner, and Holland ranks second after Germany as the major destination in the EU for Russian exports. At the port of Rotterdam in South Holland, Europe's busiest hub, Russia accounts for nearly 15% of total throughput. The sanctions will cut both ways.
the sanctions could lead to another deep recession for Europe?
It could hurt us a lot. And you're absolutely right, those things need to be considered, and they are serious issues. But we don't want to live in a world anymore where the international rule of law is not the norm. We want to live in a world where the international rule of law is the norm. We don't want to live in a world where the strong man decides what is happening.
Nou, hier zie je de energie cockpit even de lantaarnpaal aanstaan. Zie je precies de raketten staan.
On a Monday evening at Hilversum in Holland, the team behind a popular TV talk show is getting ready for airtime. Tonight's programme is a special entirely on MH17. It's the first broadcast to bring together relatives, experts and people early on the scene.
3, 2, 1, live.
Dag dames en heren, we zijn er weer met Knevel en Van der Brink.
Wanneer doen we het bij jou doen meteen? Het klinkt als geregeld.
The families of those who died speak of their trauma and anguish.
Ja, het doet je goed dat er zoveel mensen eigenlijk hun respect tonen hiervoor. En hoewel het dus niet de pijn verzacht van het verdriet dat je hebt, haal je wel de kracht eruit om weer de volgende dag bijvoorbeeld door te komen.
Ja, de pijn wordt niet minder, maar het helpt wel.
Amid the pain and grieving, Chris Klepp speaks dispassionately about the realpolitik of war.
Ik hoorde vanmorgen iemand op tv zeggen, nou, misschien dat het wel heel goed is dat de Oekraïners dat gebied gaan veroveren, want dat is een pro-westers leger en dat zal dan wel heel fijn toestemming gaan geven om dat onderzoek te geven. Dat kan ik nu al zeggen, dat is onzin. Ja, dan zal dat de 6 of de 7. If you look at the crash site and what happened, one of the things that strikes everyone is the complete lack of respect, the complete desecration of the site. I think it has something to do with our standard of civilization, in which each human life has become a tragedy. The loss of each human life has become a tragedy. In a war, you need to take civilians first, you take priority. In the Ukraine, they do not. It is a simple fact.
Alert heeft gemaakt om...
Also on the panel is a well-known Dutch journalist, Rudy Bauma, who was the first Dutch TV reporter at the site.
Met de missie.
Verschrikkelijk om te zien hoe daar de persoonlijke bezittingen van de inzittenden van MH17 lagen, verspreid tussen de brokstukken van het vliegtuig, zo ver je kon kijken. Ik zag persoonlijke bezittingen als de t-shirtjes van I Love Amsterdam, dagboeken, persoonlijke reisverslagen, knuffels van kinderen.
Je saw books, diaries, cards with personal text on it, which you are not allowed to see normally, which you shouldn't see, but it's all lying there in the field. It's so open, and obviously there's the remainings of the passengers on board, and it was very hard because the smell is very tough to handle.
When there's an event like
even tougher because it was personal.
dangerous situation.
I was getting text messages from an acquaintance of mine who actually lost people on the plane, his family-in-law. And he was asking me, how is it on the crash site? How are they dealing with the bodies? Are they treating with respect? What are they doing with the personal belongings? So during my work, I was getting confronted with the fact that, also people in my surroundings were actually killed in this plane. And my cameraman, Joris Hentenaar, he lost a friend on the plane. And in that way, this reporting was extra personal, extra emotional also for us.
Amid the carnage, Rudy Bauma was struck by the sea of sunflowers.
How did you feel when you saw those fields of sunflowers?
It's so surrealistic. Actually, the fields are not only just in the neighborhood of the crash site. For instance, the cockpit, it actually crashed inside the sunflower field. It's just in the middle. There's sunflowers all around it. And it's so surrealistic that such a horrible scene is surrounded by such beauty.
Rudy and his cameraman decided to pick some flowers in memory of the fallen.
We ended up with a big box of sunflowers and other flowers we took from the crash site, and we took them to Holland.
The flowers ended up with renowned Dutch still life photographic artist Bas Muse.
So all of these flowers are from the crash site?
Well, not all from the crash site. These roses, Ukrainian roses, are from memorial sites. These thistle here and little chamomile over here. Yeah, of course, the sunflowers.
Yes,
you see them here.
the sunflowers in various stages.
Yeah, really various stages. Degeneration.
Initially, Bas was commissioned to make an artwork in memory of the friends of Rudy and his cameraman who died in the crash. It's now become a project in memory of all the victims.
They were there at the crash site. They were witnesses of what happened. I just want to make my art a reaction on what happened, and I just want to make beauty and want people to realize that life is too beautiful to shoot each other.
Of course, we're known by the sunflowers of Van Gogh. So in that way, I think it's an extra strong symbol to have this artwork. And also, it shouldn't be like a bouquet of mourning, it should be like a bouquet of life. I think that sunflowers represent hope for life.
Across in East Ukraine, the wreckage of the plane still lies in the fields, and the war goes on as autumn nears and the sunflower season ends.